Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Malcolm Guite. Malcolm is a poet, an Anglican priest, and a rock and roller. Even fronts his own rock and roll band there, I think, in Cambridge. But most recently, he's getting a lot of acclaim for Volume 1 of an epic 4-volume series that he's putting out, the King Arthur tales that he's recounting in the English ballad, and it's beautiful. I've worked through most of Volume 1. It's lovely and beautiful stuff. This is a remarkable conversation. It went some places I didn't expect it might go, and I think that some of it's provocative in some of the best ways. Perhaps Malcolm's central intellectual achievement is establishing what we might call this robust theology of imagination, arguing that the poetic imagination is not merely decorative, but a vital truth-bearing faculty, that beauty itself is a truth-bearing faculty. You'll hear him talk about all that in the interview. Enjoy. Hey friends, Lee here. If you enjoy our conversations at the intersection of faith, purpose, and living well, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, With and For, hosted by Dr. Pam King. With and For's latest season brings together psychology and spiritual wisdom in a way that feels thoughtful, grounded, deeply human, and it's hosted by my friend Dr. Pam King, a developmental psychologist and ordained minister who offers practical guidance towards a life of thriving. I'd recommend starting with their episode featuring Parker J. Palmer, world-renowned writer, speaker, activist, Quaker elder who focuses on issues in education, spirituality, and social change. A moving and instructive conversation. Can't recommend it enough. Also, check out With and For's special summer series of wisdom practices. Released each Monday, they're short exercises shared by guests that will become a toolkit for thriving. Consider them your experiment in becoming more fully alive. So go ahead, follow With and For, hosted by Dr. Pam King, wherever you're listening now.
Hi there, it's Demetria Kaladimos at the Nashville Banner. Every week I sit down with well-known and sometimes unknown Nashvillians on our podcast, Banner & Company. It's a half hour, give or take, that will open your eyes, touch your heart, make you laugh, and we hope get to know your neighbors in a new and more meaningful way. You're in good company with Banner & Company. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Tanya Mosley, co-host of Fresh Air. You'll see your favorite actors, directors, and comedians on late-night TV shows or YouTube. But what you get with Fresh Air is a deep dive. Spend some quality time with people like Billie Eilish, Questlove, Ariana Grande, Stephen Colbert, and so many more. We ask questions you won't hear asked anywhere else. Listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.
Malcolm Guite, welcome to No Small Endeavor.
I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah,
thank you for having me.
Grateful to have you. Talking to us there from where? In Cambridge?
No, I've moved out from Cambridge now. I've allegedly retired. So I'm in the county of Norfolk. Very different from Norfolk, Virginia, but this is on the east coast of England, just about 5 miles in from the coast.
Well, we're delighted to have you with us today. I wonder, I read some stories about your having been born in Nigeria and the cultural riches of that experience, and then a mother who would read you Arthurian legends. But when you think back about that early childhood, what are some of the earliest images, smells, visions, memories that you have of that early childhood experience?
Well, yes, I was born in Nigeria, in the town of Ibadan, and I have good memories of that. Although I was about 5 or 6 when we left Nigeria, but I can remember intense tropical rainstorms, great thunderstorms and lightning, and the rain coming down so massively that you could see the low mist of it sort of bouncing off the sort of channels and gullies outside the house. And we had a long, low veranda. I loved to go in under the veranda and hear the sheer sound of it in the roof. But actually, left to my own devices, I would run out and dance and jump around in it. I felt very energized by it. So I remember that. I remember banana trees and pawpaws in the garden and literally going out and plucking breakfast off the fruit of the trees. I remember having to take the anti-malaria quinine pills, which I very much disliked.
And then what about your mother reading to you?
Well, that's a whole other thing. My mother, she not only read, she recited. My mother had a vast treasury of poetry and story and song. which she could just summon at will, and which was genuinely enchanting. I mean, the word chant is inside the word enchanting, which we may talk about later. But so she told me, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm now writing an Arthuriad, she told me the stories of Arthur, but she told me all kinds of stories. And then she read to me, I mean, between them, my parents read me all the Narnia books and The Hobbit and so on. So I was very much, my imagination was, to borrow a phrase of Lewis's, sort of baptized in a way through that. But she also recited poetry. And every time it came to Burns night, she was Scottish, but she spoke with a kind of fairly standard, what we call RP, received pronunciation accent, which she'd acquired at a certain point. But she could slip back into broad Scots whenever she wanted to. And sometimes she'd use Scots phrases. If I was clambering around on rocks near the sea or something and she thought I was, she'd call out, "Cor canny, my laddie." And cor canny means be careful. But, I just learned that phrase. And she was full of Scots saws and proverbs, which are saws and proverbs generally. So she'd sometimes say to me, "You've the gift of the gab very galloping." But then she'd always follow it up with the phrase, "Your tongue will get you hung." But she recited Burns on Burns night. It was absolutely magnificent, yeah.
And then at what point you're sent to boarding school at some point in England?
Yeah, that was kind of traumatic in its own way, although I recognize that I benefited from it immensely in the long term because it was a very good school. But yeah, when we lived in Nigeria and then in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia as it was then. We were there for so-called UDI, the Declaration of Independence, which was basically a right-wing coup by a chap called Ian Smith, who was trying to turn Rhodesia into a little South Africa. But he wasn't able to introduce apartheid laws while it was still a crown colony because the English wouldn't have stood for it. So he broke away and set up. And my parents didn't recognize the legality of his government. He put the Governor General, the Queen's representative, under house arrest. So my parents paid a courtesy call on him, thus declaring their allegiance. And eventually my father was expelled. But we went to England briefly, back to Cambridge, where my dad had been a student. And then he got a professorship in Canada. So we were off to Canada. And then by sort of 71, 72, when I was about to go into high school in Canada, we were living in Hamilton, my dad suddenly decided that I might be losing my British identity, which is really ironic because, although we'd gone back to England each year from Africa on the long leave, while Dad went back to Oxford or Cambridge to do his research, so I knew. But so anyway, so he sent me to an English boarding school. It was mainly a day school. It's a very good, private, we would call public, you would call private, academic school. He knew I, was reasonably bright and would benefit from a pretty thorough academic education, which I did. But it had a small and, in my view, or certainly in retrospect, kind of fairly dysfunctional boarding house. About 60 or 70 boys out of the 1,000 in the school were cooped up in this house. And I was very homesick, and I found the whole, it was a very strange double life for me because in the summer holidays and Christmas, I was a kind of burgeoning Canadian teenager, listening to Neil Young and, Joni Mitchell and Leonard Cohen. And then I had to suddenly become this buttoned-up British schoolboy, in the term time, a sort of transmogrified mid-Atlantic, But I'd already got the love of poetry, and I'd inherited from my mother, and I'd inherited from my mother a retentive memory. But eventually it was there that I really began to understand, the whole range of literature, and I specialized in literature and in English and history and French for my A-levels, and then won a scholarship to Cambridge in 1977 to study English literature.
Now, do I understand correctly that during that time you began to question faith or lose faith or walk away from faith, or what's that experience like? Yeah. What was that experience like for you?
It was a mixture of things. Very difficult, to kind of reconstruct these things. My father was a Methodist local preacher. He had a very strong, clear faith, and I used to hear him preach, But he was always, he had a tremendous sense that God is everywhere, and he was very full on there's no distinction between the sacred and the secular. God is everywhere. And whatever you do to the glory of God. You know, if you're playing cricket or anything else, it doesn't have to be a pious activity. So I did have this sense of God being everywhere, but I was very unprepared for some of the I was unprepared for the loneliness. I was unprepared for the, some of the bullying that went on in and other forms of oppression in this kind of school. And I was also unprepared for the full-on, it was a very secular school, the full-on application of, if you like, the secular narrative, which was, of course, that belief and Christianity was belonged to the childhood of mankind, you know, and that if you carried on believing this sort of stuff, you were sort of intellectually stunted, you know, that we needed to understand that we now understood what was ascribed to God could now be understood in terms of physics and biology and chemistry. And we had a physics teacher, actually, who was particularly keen on Newtonian mechanics and, you know, cause and effect, and particularly the preservation of momentum, you know, the mass times velocity of one object striking another one. The other object as it moves will have the same mass times velocity, you know, and it'll go slower if it's a heavier object and faster if it's a light one, but it all comes out the same. There's an equation here. And that this was allowed for a perfect explanation of all events, including necessarily, and one must be brave enough to think this, the physical events that go on in the head, which we mistake for thought and soul and feeling and originality and all of these things. We were taught the word epiphenomenon. These were an epiphenomenon accidentally thrown up by the mere concatenation of atoms resounding around in our skulls. And we didn't have Richard Dawkins then, but we had B.F. Skinner, who was a behaviorist. And, you know, there was a sense in which, we were effectively, you know, selfish, self-replicating genes and unwinding enzymes, which had accidentally acquired consciousness, but the consciousness added up to nothing, and you better just whistle in the dark and make the best of it. So that was a view I began to hold. And, you know, of course, it gave you the immense advantage of being superior to everybody else in the past, including your parents. You know. But my parents were very patient with me about this. But the one thing that I had a very vivid experience when I was about 16, visiting, by which time I took this whole view on, and I was going to be a marine biologist and, you know, all of this. And I went to John Keats's house and read on the wall Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, which I hadn't come across before, rather amazingly, because, of course, it's one of the many poems my mother knew by heart, but maybe I'd heard it and forgotten it. But it was an absolutely transcendent experience. I mean, it is the most beautiful and evocative poem. And it really had me, because I was very grumpy and moody and sort of depressed when I was dragged there by an aunt of mine. I didn't want to be there. And, you know, I was reading the poem on the wall because there was nothing better to do while she went round all the exhibits. And it starts very unpromisingly, you know, my heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past, and lethe words had sunk. So like dull, ache, sunk, lethe, you know, I was there. And then, as you may know, the poem suddenly lifts off into this transcendent beauty. And he doesn't even tell you that he's heard a nightingale singing. He just says, "'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease." And I'm reading this and be like, what was that? And too happy to go from "I'm really depressed," which Keats was too, I mean, he was dying, "too happy in thine happiness," and that melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless. And as you know, it's a very sensual poem. He goes out in the dark and he can hear the bird in the tree, and he's, you know, "I cannot tell what flowers are at my feet or what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, you know, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet." And then he's kind of calling for wine in the poem, you know, he's saying, "Oh, for a draught of vintage full of the warm south, you know, full of the true and blushful being cooled a long age in the deep delved earth." And I was just amazed. But of course, even the rich sensuality and the happiness and the beauty of the bird's song, he goes further. And then he realizes this beauty is confronting his mortality. And yet there is something immortal going on here. Thou must not born for death, immortal bird. And then out of nowhere, suddenly appears the biblical figure of Ruth. And he imagines Ruth hearing a nightingale just like he is. The song found its way into the sad heart of Ruth when, sick for home, she stood in tears amidst the alien corn, the alien corn's fun. So here's this, and I was now realizing the poem was making me admit, I was sick for home. But I was also sick for home, not just home that I knew. Because as you know, towards the very end of the poem, he has this extraordinary image where he imagines the song of the bird opening something, kind of at the back of the poem. There's a window. He says, the song hath charmed open, magic casements opening on perilous seas and fairylands forlorn. This yearning. And then he comes back to himself and, here am I stuck. But he can still hear the bird. It's getting further away. And the poem ends with this completely open question. It says, fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? Years later, I discovered that C.S. Lewis's great friend Owen Barfield had defined poetry, or the effect of poetry, as a felt change of consciousness. And that's certainly what I experienced there. And I kept reading the poem again and again until I practically knew it by heart. And of course, I went home and went total Keats binge and got into the romantics and Keats. But when I walked into that house, I think I was ready to have a completely reductive explanation of everything, that the material account was a totalizing account and it left room for nothing immaterial or transcendent. Completely what I learned Charles Taylor later called the immanent frame. There's no other axis. But when I walked out, I felt something irreducible had happened. That I didn't doubt that there were all kinds of synapses firing and that you could have done interesting brain chemistry on me while I was experiencing the poem. But I had no doubt equally that the brain chemistry would never explain the poem. That it might be the vessel. So what that experience did, it didn't make me a Christian or anything like that. And Keats wasn't a Christian, that had to come later. But it cracked open the kind of heavy, reductive, super analytic material account of things that I had, and it opened the possibility of transcendence. And it made me realize that there's some sort of link between that transcendence and beauty, and there's something beyond death in the beauty. So that was quite a lot to be going on with from one poem.
For sure. I mean, how do you account now, decades later, looking back, that it was poetry that would crack that kind of moment open for you, as opposed to, say, some sort of apologetical or propositional kind of argument about immanence?
Well, I certainly later I did get into the apologetic and propositional side of things, and that was important to me too, because I didn't want to think this was all just wishful thinking. I wanted to know if there was a rational account of the world which could account for that kind of transcendent experience. But the reductive materialist was not that account. But why was it poetry? I think it's partly because there was a sort of there was a layer of poetry underneath everything that was already there from my mother. But one of the ways in which I coped with being away from home and with all of that, and with having to prove myself to the other boys and, find my own identity and all this stuff. I mean, this is an all boys school, of course. One of the ways I did that was by just completely sealing off all the home stuff. If I thought about the home stuff, and the home stuff for me very much included poetry, I would end up crying, which would obviously be the ultimate and unforgivable sin from which you would never recover. This was the kind of school where you learn precisely to have a stiff upper lip. So I think the poetry suddenly cracked through that, and I realized that I'd been trying to operate with this reductive material thing against almost all my early understanding and memory. So it was it felt like a discovery at the time, but I now realize it was a recovery, not just a discovery.
And then was it an encounter with reading the Psalms that was another significant moment for you? And
Yeah. So poetry became my way into everything. And I came very much to be convinced. I mean, later I wrote academic books trying to find out why this is the case, that poetry is a way of knowing that the imagination is to some degree a truth-bearing faculty. Years later, I read C.S. Lewis's spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, where he talks about reading George MacDonald. And he says, as a hard-boiled atheist teenager, he reads George MacDonald and something happens. And he says, here's a very interesting phrase. He says, I suppose in imagination, where my imagination was baptized. And essentially the entire plot or thrust of Surprised by Joy is Lewis saying, my imagination was baptized first and the rest of me took a little bit longer to catch up. But the bit that did the catching up was very important as well. That was the bit that thought, is it reasonable to hold faith? Can you think intelligently from faith? Of course, you can't prove it from first principles or it wouldn't be faith. Something has to be received. But having received that something, does that something, that presupposition, make more or less sense of the world than the presuppositions you're leaving? I mean, St. Augustine, of course, famously puts it in, his lapidary Latin, credo ut intelligam, I believe in order to understand. I don't believe as an alternative to understanding. And of course, that's developed later by St. Anselm when he defines theology as fides quaerens intellectum. It's faith. You're given the faith, but you then use it to seek understanding. I mean, Lewis famously says, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun rises, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So I started with the poetry. That's what led me through. I came up to university because of this Keats experience. I couldn't really describe myself as an atheist. I was an atheist shading into agnostic. I mean, agnostic in the very proper sense. I had no idea where this transcendent beauty came from, but it didn't arise as a meaningless byproduct of chemical interaction. I began to realize the flow must be the other way around. That the complex chemistry of the brain must be a vessel or a vehicle for something, which was more than physical. So I was, if you like, in that sense, open to the spiritual dimension and I looked everywhere, of course. I became, obviously, as a young man who's trying to put distance between himself and his upbringing and all the rest of it, the last place I wanted to find any of this was Christianity. So obviously I did all the things. I became really interested in Zen. I read a lot of Taoist literature. I really read and loved and continue to love the Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, for example. But I was studying English literature, so it was necessary to read theology in order to understand. You're not going to read Milton unless you read Augustine. But I was recommended, reading Augustine's Confessions completely blew my mind. It totally took away the idea that Christianity is for dummies, because one of the things you could become aware of pretty shortly into your reading of the Confessions is that you are in the presence of a mind which is considerably more capacious and far better furnished than your own. And, you're not going to, Augustine literally in Book 10 talked about walking around the vast spaces of his mind, But anyway, but when he says famously, as you can imagine after my Keats experience, when I get to the famous passage where he encounters Christ from within as well as without, and he says, late, late have I loved you, beauty always ancient, always new. I thought, that's a clue. But obviously I didn't want to go the whole hog, and I also thought, perhaps I'm just making all this up, and perhaps he's just making it all up. But I began to wonder whether Christianity might be symbolically true, but not actually the case. That there might be something compelling about the entire arc of the story, from creation through fall, redemption, and final hope, and the journey, as it were, from the garden through the wilderness to the kind of garden city, the big arc. The first books on the reading list for Cambridge literature in those days, in the 70s, if you wanted to understand the background to English literature. The first two books were the King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. They weren't asking you to read that as a believer or to find belief. They were asking you to read that so you know where everybody else is coming from and you spot the allusions and the quotations when they come. I mean, they could do with doing that again now. I mean, you read some literary criticism, people have got absolutely no idea of the biblical foundations of the books they're reading. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So the real break, so I went on kind of half believing or saying, well, this is true, but it's only true mentally or it's only true subjectively, which is very useful because then it doesn't interfere with your lifestyle. It makes no moral demands on you. You know, there's no question of Augustine being moved by Augustine's account of God as beauty, ever interfering with sort of sex and drugs and rock and roll. So, you know, there's a bit of a tension there. And I think God then just thought he'd better make a move on me. So I was reading the Psalms as part of understanding the poetry of George Herbert and Sir Philip Sidney, you know, and obviously Shakespeare. I was reading Coverdale's translation aloud. And I was reading Psalm 145, and which, of course, has extraordinary psalm. The most frequently used word in that psalm is all. The Lord has mercy over all his works. The Lord has made all these things. The Lord is nigh unto all who call upon him. The Lord is nigh unto all who fall. I mean, it's extraordinary. And I was somewhere in the midst, of all those alls, you know, one must be included. Anyway, I was reciting this and I had kind of a very sudden experience, which was absolutely, you know, I mean, the phrase life-changing is overused. People talk about a cup of coffee as though it were life-changing, but, you know, it's like using awesome to describe a pair of sneakers. But anyway, one moment, you know, I'm reciting this psalm alone in a room, in an empty house, because I was house-sitting for someone, you know, with all my usual muddles and miseries, but savouring the words nevertheless. And the next minute, I'm not alone in the room at all. I mean, there is a completely undeniable presence, a holy presence, an unbearably holy presence, a presence in whose presence I felt I didn't belong at all. And the effect of it really was like a massive and slightly vertiginous shift in perspective. So obviously, just in terms of one's actual visual perspective, because we all look out of our own heads, as it were, and then see the world in increasing circles around us, we cannot help physically being the center of our own world. That's what we are. We're in the center, and then everything else is arranged around it. I mean, that's just a physical fact. It's when it becomes a moral or an emotional fact that you start getting real decay, you know, when people really think they are the center of the world. But anyway, I had this complete shift in perspective in which the center was fully occupied by, I shall now call him God, an absolutely transcendent, holy creator. And I'm way, way, way off on the edge somewhere. And sort of dangling by a thread over the void, and a sense that if he looked away from me for a moment, I'd fall into nothingness. But equally, I couldn't bear to look at him, you know, because I felt like I shouldn't even be here. So it was a very disturbing experience. And also interesting because I think the thing I prided myself on most was my independence. And I could not have realized myself to be more dependent. And it was essentially, there is a creator and you are a creature, you know, get used to it. You are not actually the center of the cosmos at all. You know, there is something. Anyway, I didn't know what to do with this and I was hoping it would go away, but it didn't. So I went back to my college early before term started. And eventually, in desperation, went to see the college chaplain, who, as it happens, an American Episcopalian priest, Warren Tangi, a lovely guy, very gentle guy, very wise guy. So I told him this had happened to me and I didn't know what to do with it. He said, well, of course this happened to you. You're in trouble. You've been taking the name of God in vain. You know, you recited these psalms as though they were a background. But God is the prime mover and the ground of all being and the word, in whom and through whom all things are spoken and sustained into being. It's not up to you to call him background, you know, and you named his name in the poetry that he himself has given us. you could hardly be surprised that he came. And, so, well, fine, but what do I do now? So he then said, well, the Psalms are obviously the key. Has it ever occurred to you, instead of running away from this presence the whole time or trying to turn your back on it and hoping it goes away, try to see if you can squeeze yourself back into the center, has it not occurred to you to carry on with the Psalms, but this time address the one whom you were ignoring when you blasphemously used them earlier on? It was all quite shocking stuff, Nowadays, a chaplain would congratulate you and pat you on the head for having had a remotely religious thought. But this guy was, old school. So he said, look, I say the Psalms every morning and every evening because that's part of my order as a priest. And I sometimes there are people in chapel, sometimes there aren't, but I do it in morning and evening prayer according to the Book of Common Prayer. Why don't you come and join me and, say them to God? So I began to do that, and that was suddenly I could be in this presence, and I became fully charged with the sort of sheer power of the poetry of the Psalms. But he did a very interesting thing. He said, at the end of every Psalm, Malcolm, he said, I'm going to stand, and I'm going to say the Gloria. I'm going to say glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was at the beginning, is now and ever shall be, world without end. And he said, I forbid you to do that. He said, you're in enough trouble as it is with taking the name of the Father in vain, without rabbiting on about the Son and the Spirit, of which you know nothing. And I was, going to interrupt him. He said, look, I know you've read Augustine, and I know you've got an O-level in religious studies. So what, you can describe the outward framework of a Christian statement about these things. But that's got nothing to do with knowledge of actually knowing the Father or the Son or the Spirit. The Father you know. So just wait. And so I carried on like this. And then later on, a friend of mine, a Roman Catholic friend of mine, actually took me to hear a Franciscan friar preaching in Cambridge. And again, this was allegedly background research to medieval poetry, because Cambridge was partly formed, the universities of Europe were formed by the mendicant orders, by the Black Friars, the Dominicans, and the Grey Friars, the Franciscans. So let's have the medieval experience. And he was preaching. It was absolutely brilliant. Anyway, he began talking about how a babe in the womb is entirely dependent upon its parent and hangs from the thread, as it were, of the umbilical cord, and can do nothing. And even if the baby is born, it can't, doesn't actually physically have the strength even to turn itself over. All it can do is cry and hope to be heard and to be nurtured and nourished and fed. It's utterly, utterly helpless. And I thought, I was thinking, God, that's exactly the way I am with this holy presence. I'm hanging on a thread. And he could have been, he said, you think I'm going to tell you that that's how we all are with God, the transcendent creator. And I said, and in one way it would be true if we regard him simply as the transcendent creator. We are utterly dependent. However, I'm here to tell you the exact opposite. I'm here to tell you that the utter helplessness of the babe who can only cry and hope to be picked up and heard is how God comes to us. It's the only way he can come to us. This is what Christmas means. This is what, the babe in the manger could have been kicked by the ox and ass. The God on whom we all depend became utterly dependent. Why? Why would God do that? And he says it's because he loves us. And then he did this brilliant thing. This is long before the Me Too generation. He said, like, you cannot love de haut en bas. If you love somebody and you are in power and in charge over them and you hold all the cards, there's no possibility of love. There's no possibility of real reciprocity. And what love does, as soon as you really love someone, the first thing, it's the traditional image of the man getting down on his knee to propose. You don't tower over anybody you love. You come on the level with them. And what's more, you make yourself completely vulnerable. The first part of love is to say, I love you so much that you can, in fact, hurt me by rejecting me, or I'm going to make myself vulnerable and exposed to that. And he says, this is what God does. Without ceasing to be God, he comes to us in and through the Son in Christ. And then he finished, because this was a Catholic chaplain, so he said, and if you think he's was helpless in the womb of Mary, and even more helpless, subject to the dangers of the stable, lying in the straw, defenseless, certainly not going to strike us. We think how completely vulnerable he is in this wafer. There's no arms or legs. You could take the wafer, the consecrated wafer, the presence of himself to you, and you could put it to the floor. You could spit on it and grind it under your foot. That's the risk he takes to come to you. And somehow in the midst of all of that, the penny dropped. And I didn't cease to think of God as completely holy, but I also thought of God as completely human. And actually, there was a really interesting moment there, because I realized for the first time in my life, I think, certainly my adult life, I felt it was okay to be a human being. Because in the days of my atheism, I was completely cowed by the massive, one of the reasons why I said all religion is crap and you can't believe it, and it's, was I said, we're a tiny little smear of accidental life on one edge of a fringe of galaxies. We can't, look at the billions of stars, the millions of dimensions, but how can we know anything? I was cowed by the scale of the universe, and there's a lot of brutal atheist preaching, if you like, which is doing that, which is using the cosmos as a big stick to beat you with into submission. And suddenly I thought, no, wait a minute, what if the maker of all this is in this and comes to me as a fellow human being? And then, I then later realized, takes the vulnerability to the nth degree and allows himself to be crucified in order to show what that love is, and then offers us resurrection. So all this started to come to fruition. And then, so I went back to the chaplain and said, I think I can say the Gloria now. And I did that, and he prepared me for confirmation, and I was confirmed and became a communicant member of the Church of England in the spring of 1980. But I think if God hadn't done that direct intervention in that room, reading Psalm 145, I would have been clever enough to carry on having it both ways, and saying, I'll read lots of Christian poetry and it'll be great, but I won't bother to change my life or actually worship a God, actually say, no, you're God, I'm not God. You're in the center, I'm not in the center. You're transcendent, I'm immanent. You are a creator, I'm a creature. I needed a radical moral and philosophic revolution.
Yeah.
To not only know, but absolutely delight in my contingent creaturehood. And when you do that, it's an immense relief, because you don't have to be the bigot, you don't have to be the be-all and end-all of things. It doesn't matter whether people pay attention. Somebody else is there doing all of that.
Thank you for all that.
Sorry, long answer to a short
remarkable,
question.
Remarkable.
This is Tanya Mosley, co-host of Fresh Air. You'll see your favorite actors, directors, and comedians on late-night TV shows or YouTube. But what you get with Fresh Air is a deep dive. Spend some quality time with people like Billie Eilish, Questlove, Ariana Grande, Stephen Colbert, and so many more. We ask questions you won't hear asked anywhere else. Listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.
Hi there, it's Demetria Kaladimos at the Nashville Banner. Every week I sit down with well-known and sometimes unknown Nashvillians on our podcast, Banner & Company. It's a half hour, give or take, that will open your eyes, touch your heart, make you laugh, and we hope, get to know your neighbors in a new and more meaningful way. You're in good company with Banner & Company. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, my friends. We're getting ready to launch another No Small Endeavor cohort set to begin in September. These have been a delight. Our cohort invites intellectually curious individuals to deeply explore what it means to live a good life, with the ultimate goal that our work together will make space for greater resilience, joy, and a vision for how to contribute meaningfully to the world around us. If you're someone who's interested in asking big questions like what sort of life is a life worth living, and how am I pursuing my vision of a good life, if you're interested as well in considering those kinds of questions in light of moral philosophy, human psychology, and the social sciences, and a generous, hospitable Christian theology, then you might just be the perfect candidate. You can check out our socials or navigate to our website, nosmallendeavor.com/cohort. Again, that's nosmallendeavor.com/cohort. There you can learn more and submit an interest form. Again, that's nosmallendeavor.com/cohort. We look forward to hearing from you. I wonder, in your identification with the vulnerability there, how that relates to, I know that you've been open about your kind of own experiences with depression. How would you see that sort of awareness of the crucial way in which you began to see a new truth or a new beauty through vulnerability, has that then bubbled up in your own life through that kind of vulnerability?
Yeah, well, I think when you see God's vulnerability in Christ, I mean, obviously the Latin word, literally, vulnerable in Latin means woundable. The vulnerability, you could be wounded. And obviously, it's like the poet Michael O'Sheill has a great line where he says, "Here I am, your host, open and woundable." But so when you see that as an essential part of God's loving, and as God as that risk-taking God, that not willing to shield himself, opening his arms for you on the cross and meeting all the hurts and hatreds of the world and turning, then that actually changes the nature of your own relationship with your own vulnerability. You see that your vulnerability might be a gift as well as a cross, and that some things that you experience, particularly as in my case, you occasionally experience, quite severe depression, which obviously while you're experiencing it is terrible and you can't do anything, inside it. You're not sitting there thinking pious thoughts, but you realize you're coming close. So in my cycle I've got the book that I suppose I first became known by in terms of being a poet was a cycle of sonnets called Sounding the Seasons, which went through the whole of the Christian year. And I did a series of sonnets for the Stations of the Cross. And of course, in the Stations, Jesus falls 3 times. And you write the poem for the first one, you think, okay, I get this, I can play on the word fall, the cross has fallen on him, he's right, fine. And then you have to write it again. It's the second time, and I began to write about when stuff happens to you twice, or when a bruised bruise, or a reopened wound, something that triggers or whatever. But then I got to the third fall. I thought, what am I supposed to do with this? And at that point, of course, the poetry takes over and kicks in, and you realize something. And the third fall became a poem in which I actually wrote about the experience of depression. I didn't expect to do that. And what I experienced in doing it, and this is the poem probably of all, one of the poems out of them that I get most correspondence about, and most people who've been through this said, "Oh God, thank God you wrote that one," kind of thing. This and another one called The Christian Plummet. And it's about recognizing that you're nearer to God and God is nearer to you. Even in that, I mean, I don't know if you've got time for a swift sonnet. It takes about a minute to read.
Please.
So Jesus falls for the 3rd time. He weeps with you, and with you he will stay when all your staying power has run out. You can't go on. You go on anyway. He stumbles just beside you when the doubt that always haunts you cuts you down at last and takes away the hope that drove you on. This is the 3rd fall, and it hurts the worst, this long descent through darkness to depression from which there seems no rising and no will to rise or breathe or bear your own heartbeat. Twice you survived. This 3rd will surely kill. And you could almost wish for that defeat, except that in the cold hell where you freeze, you find your God beside you on his knees.
Thank you. Thank you. So here in your most recent endeavor, which is certainly a large one, a retelling, epic retelling of the Arthurian legends. Why have you counted that so important to do such work?
Yeah. So one of the nice things about, having a consequence of becoming a Christian and, it was a reconnection with my deepest childhood roots in lots of ways, and it cleared away the stuff. And I was able to look back and see what astonishingly good people my parents were. It's always difficult for you when you're a teenager to know how good your parents are, but eventually you realize it. Anyway, both my parents in their different ways. But my mother, I began to remember more and more, really, of what she'd done and what she'd said. And I had a lifelong love of the King Arthur stories, basically because my mother told them to me. And she told them to me really, really well. And she didn't hold back. I didn't get some Disney-fied, sanitized version of them. So, for example, when I was about 8, she told me, people have heard of the Holy Grail, and people talk about the quest for the Holy Grail as though it was some sort of prize for best behavior or some sort of individual achievement, in the American way of, both having celebrities and wanting constant competition between individuals. That's kind of the way it's told. But of course, the medieval sources don't tell it like that at all. The story of the Grail starts really, obviously the story of the Grail starts with Christ and the Last Supper and Joseph of Arimathea bringing the Grail to England and so on, and Glastonbury legend, all of that. But the achievement of the Grail, this whole question of why it has to happen and who does it, and goes back to a story that's called the Dolorous Blow or the Dolorous Stroke, in which an ill-starred knight called Balin finds his way into the Grail Castle, not knowing that it's the Grail Castle, not knowing that these hallows are kept hidden there. And he's told to leave his weapons at the door, and the Grail King, the Fisher King, has laws of complete hospitality that we the guest is sacred. The host is there to protect the guest. The guests must regard each other as sacred, which is, of course, precisely the law of hospitality that God has given us when he's hosted us in the place we call the earth, But anyway, so he shouldn't be picking up weapons. Anyway, in the story, Balin is trying to get some revenge on a knight called Galahad, and he stabs him in the course of this feast, thus breaking these laws, and his dagger breaks. He's concealed a dagger, and so he flees, and the king, Pelles, pursues him, and he goes through all these different parts of the castle and eventually gets to the Hallows. And it's my mother telling me this story, about 8, he can hear these high angelic voices, he can feel this presence, and then he starts hearing words in the voices, and the words are saying, man of blood, step no further, man of blood, turn back, do not come in here, kind of thing. But he's being pursued and he's weaponless. He's been running around the castle trying to find a weapon, Normally there's spears or shields or swords on walls of castles. Like, why not here? Of course, it's the Grail Castle. That's why. So eventually, of course, he comes into the Grail Chapel and he comes into the presence of the Grail. And this is the chalice that has Christ's blood in it. And above it is the spear of Longinus hovering in the air, Longinus was the soldier who pierced Christ's heart. And it was one of the 3 holy things that were brought to Britain by Joseph of Arimathea, the chalice, which is the Grail, and the paten and the spear. And the voices say, fall on your feet, fall to the floor, don't look. I remember my mother saying to me, it's just like, she told me all the Bible stories as well. So she said, it's like when Moses, when he sees the burning bush and the voice says, take off your shoes from off your feet for the place where you are standing on its holy ground, which of course, Moses does the right thing at that point. But Balin, because he's full of this rage and he's full of fear and he wants to defend himself, ignores it all. I say, oh, Mum, don't tell me what he'd say. He runs forward, he grabs the spear. And he turns it around, this one spear, and he wounds the Pelles, the Fisher King, is coming after him, and he rushes towards him, intending to kill him. And he pierces him deep in the thigh. He maims the king. And at that moment, as soon as he does that, that's the Dolorous Stroke, that entire part of the castle falls down. And they're buried underground for 3 days and for 3 nights, and him and the wounded Fisher King and the Grail and the spear. And then, of course, on the 3rd day, Merlin comes and moves the stones, and plenty of resonances here. And when Balin comes out, Merlin says to him, you have struck the Dolorous Stroke. It's not only that you wounded your host, the king, but that because you've wounded the king and the land are one. and therefore the land is laid waste. Now the wasteland has been created, and all the fish die in the rivers, and the crops fail in the ground, and the cows can't calve, and people can't have children, and it's entirely desolate as long as the king is wounded. And then Merlin tells him that the spear was the spear that pierced Christ's heart. And I'm going like, Mum, he didn't know, you know. and my mum says he didn't know, but it was still the spear that pierced Christ's heart. And I remember Mum saying to me, why was that so terrible? Because that spear was the last and latest point, the sharp point of all the hurts and hatreds of mankind. The first thrust that led finally to the spear piercing the heart of Christ was the thrust of Cain slaying Abel. And every other piece of violence has always met with another piece of violence. That's where we are now. And at last, finally, all these things come to a point and pierce the heart of Christ, who is God himself. And that's where the hatred stops. That's where he says, Father, forgive. That's the only point at which these hatreds can stop. And so to take that spear and turn it back around and use it to continue the internecine violence, you know, anyway, a slightly less elaborate version of that. But anyway, meantime, I'm saying, but he didn't know. And what about all the people who can't have children, and the land and the crops dying and the trees withering and everything, you know? And I said to my mum, how could there even be a world in which something like one rash, stupid person who didn't really know what they were doing and were kind of filled with their own fears and revenge, how could that devastate everything? How could there be a world like that? And my mum says to me, you know, I'm about 8, and she says, well, I'm telling you this story because you need to know that you live in just such a world. And this was, of course, just after the Cuban Missile Crisis and, you know, the fears of a nuclear winter. And she said, your father and I had to think and hesitate and pray and hope before we brought you into the world, knowing that your world could be devastated by one man's rash actions. However, she said, Merlin had a word of hope before Balin had to ride for 3 days and 3 nights with everybody coming to the door and cursing him. And my mother described that. She said, one day the Grail night will come and he will undo what you've done, and he will revere the Grail where you didn't reveal it, and he will take the spear, and with the same spear with which you wounded the king, he will heal the king. The drops of Christ's blood will fall into the wound of the fisher king, and when he is healed, the wasteland will be healed. And Balin doesn't live to see that, but he knows it's going to happen. And of course that happens when Galahad comes to achieve the Grail. So, bit mind-blowing for an 8-year-old.
Sure.
But one of the things that I learned was that these stories know stuff that we don't know. That they're older and wiser than we are. And I love those stories, and I always had a feeling. And of course, as I grew up, the wasteland changed its meaning, and I began to think about ecological wasteland. But eventually, when I finally came back to my Christian faith, I really began to understand, at least if you look at early Christianity, and, you know, the link between us and the world is intimate. And, you know, when we fall, the ground is cursed because of it. When Milton describes the fall, he doesn't say Eve committed a private peccadillo. The moment Eve reaches the apple in Milton's Paradise Lost, he says, the first thing he says is, earth felt the wound, and nature sighing out through all her works gave sign that all was lost. And of course, later on, I began seriously reading the epistles of Paul, and I realized that creation was subjected to futility in hope, and that the whole creation waits for the revealing of the children of God. Now, by that time, I'd read all the official Arthurian scholarship to say the story of the wounded fisher king and of the wasteland and of the revival of the land when the king is healed, and of the Grail being part of that. This is really pre-Christian stuff with a light Christian gloss, and they had cauldrons of generation, and this is a vegetative myth. It's about why is there winter and then there's spring, and, you know, maybe they had ritual kings who ritually died, and then, you know, there's a spring revival, and it's like it's John Barleycorn or whatever. But by this time I thought, well, no, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe these stories, which were originally pre-Christian, are waiting for the fulfillment, for the coming of the key story, which makes sense of them. Like Paul in Mars Hill saying, he whom you worship without knowing, him I preach, you know. And when I really studied it, I realized these stories were told precisely to bring the beautiful old Celtic pagan stories into the light of Christ and then see what happens. Anyway, I realized they're older and I've loved them. And I also began to realize that we're living in another wasteland. And this is the wasteland of complete reductivism, the wasteland that I was in my teenagers years and that poetry got me out of, the wasteland of complete disenchantment and anime, and in the sense that this is just material, meaningless stuff and that there's no narrative anymore. That's a wasteland. And I began to realize that a story of the healing of the wasteland, particularly if it was told through poetry, might be part of a story of our healing. That, there's a lot of people talking now about re-enchantment. I mean, disenchantment was, of course, Max Weber's phrase to describe, the beginning of industrial modernism, that we were in this world of disenchantment. Now, I think it's a problematic term in the sense that to say we're going to re-enchant the world supposes that the world is genuinely disenchanted and that we have the power to re-enchant it, neither of which I think is true. I think the world is still as enchanted as ever it was and is still tingling and alive with all the meaning that God put in it. But we've chosen to ignore it. We've constructed this false carapace over the top of it. We have disenchanted ourselves, in a sense, in relation to the world. So I don't think we need so much a spell for re-enchantment as to undisenchant ourselves and be open again. And Coleridge, of course, said this is exactly what poetry is for. Poetry removes the film of familiarity and restores the wonder. So I began to think that a poetic telling of precisely this story, and with a particularly long section on the wasteland, was maybe what we needed and was part of a moment of cultural shift where we return to the sense that the world is more full of wonder and mystery than we realize, and that we need a certain humility towards it and a certain humble courtesy towards the rest of nature, which is also very much part of my theme.
What potential critics sit on your shoulder as you do that kind of work and for the sake of contributing to some sort of awareness of the enchanted nature of reality? What kind of critic sits there? What do they say? And to what are you attentive in the way that you do this storytelling in light of that? Well, I think
there are different kinds of critics. There's the ones who don't want you to do it at all, and who are the ones normally that operate almost entirely in the realm of irony about everything and undercutting everything, and what I think has been beautifully called by George Steiner the hermeneutics of suspicion, whereby you have to unmask everything and there's always something worse behind it, I'm not trying to please those critics. I've got past that. I'm willing to engage with what some people have called a second naivety and say, no, actually, we just need to be childlike towards these stories. The other critics, of course, is how do you sustain it? If I've made a name for myself as a poet in any sense, it's as a master of the sonnet, which is the short lyric form, utterly concentrated, and 14 lines and you're done. So I'm doing the exact opposite now. I'm writing a long sequence of ballads. So I have to have, as the Zen people say, you have to have beginner's mind. You have to learn a whole new series of skills. But luckily, I know, I didn't know what form to do this in. I've been wanting to do this for decades, and for a long time, my problem was form. And I was so cowed, here's the critics again, I was so cowed by the extraordinary achievements of the high modernists, Eliot, Joyce, Beckett, David Jones, where the kind of thing they write is incredibly effective if you know what's going on, but it's bristling with footnotes. And everything depends on getting an allusion to something that's an allusion to something else. And I just suddenly got sick of it. I thought, I don't want to write this kind of coterie university elitist thing. And, the thing they all fear most is being thought naive or not sufficiently sophisticated, But it's like Daisy in The Great Gatsby when she suddenly realizes maybe it's not so good to be sophisticated, when she says sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated, And so I kind of thought I need to purge myself of that. But I still want all the subtleties and beauties of high English literature. So I began to be really interested in the poets and writers who can do all the brilliant things, but don't alienate their audience and reader in the course of it. And the obvious answers to that are Shakespeare and Dickens and the great Romantic poets. And then I by this time I'd written a long study of Coleridge, specifically framed around the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a book called Mariner that came out in 2017, in which I'd shown how he'd taken the common and accessible and open ballad form and opened it out in different ways and varied it and made it into this incredibly delicate instrument for telling a wonderful and profoundly symbolic story, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is full of prophetic truth. And I suddenly realized, golly, the answer is staring me in the face. The ballad form is the way to do it, because the ballad form is not exclusive and ironic and coterie-ish. It's common. It's the common folk thing. It's what people wrote and sang before they knew how to read and write. But the ballad form has a great and distinguished literary history in terms of how it's been developed and what you can do with it if you know what you're doing. And one thing I've always tried to do in all my poetry is recover the music of English poetry. That's what I loved about Keats, was the sound. And that's what I felt was missing from most contemporary poetry, just sheer mellifluous beauty. It's what I want.
Yeah.
And I'm unashamed to want it. I mean, my muse is the English language, and I love her. And I just think, if I can extend the metaphor without being too improper, I think rhyming gives her pleasure. I think the poets used to know how to do that. And she thought, do that again. I love that. And now all the modern poets don't do it. And I'm going, come over here, honey. I know how to do that. Let's just make you sing.
Yeah, right.
And make you purr.
Yeah, I will say that just reading Galahad and the Grail, I often found myself that my experience was much richer reading it aloud than it was trying to read it silently.
It's meant to be read aloud, yeah.
And
so it's a kind of song, and there is the word chant in the word enchantment. So I am trying to re-enchant or undisenchant, and I'm trying to make something which is intrinsically beautiful. And I'm trying to be faithful to the story. I'm not making all these, so I've made some meanings explicit to you in this conversation, but I'm not doing that in the poem.
Right, yeah.
I'm trusting entirely to the story to do that with you and for you in its own way and at its own pace.
Yeah. So let me ask this one question, going back to that first kind of critic that you said that you've tried to stop pleasing or worrying about, and the so-called hermeneutic of suspicion. Earlier in our conversation, you unpacked in this beautiful way the woundedness of the creation, the manner in which our violence and our weapons continue to wound, the craziness of something like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so this beautiful pointing towards the making of peace. But I can imagine someone with a kind of hermeneutic of suspicion saying, but here you are telling a tale that presumes in its chivalry a martial, patriarchal, hierarchical structure. And can't you see your own tension? And I wonder what you would say to that. Yeah,
absolutely. So but this is the whole point about the Arthur story and the chivalry and the romance. The Arthur, if there is a historical Arthur, is a sort of Romano-British warlord in the period of, say, the 5th century when the Roman legions have withdrawn, and Britain is therefore becoming a failed state, as it were, and it's like the Americans leaving Afghanistan or wherever, all kinds of, and it was bloody and awful, and there were lots of internecine strifes, and the Celtic tribes were fighting each other. So the idea of two things about the Camelot: one is to try and bring some order, so you fight some battles, but in order to establish a peace. But the second thing is, this is a Christian kingship in a generally pagan scenario. And so the fundamental question, the real tension, is between the Sermon on the Mount and the military ethic. And is it possible? Here's a possible impossibility. Could you have a caste of warriors who were so radically converted by Christ's love for the meek and his care for children that they would do, like, raping women and brutalizing children was the way war was fought then and sadly now. So to have an oath of chivalry that you swear on Pentecost, that you will not harm women or children, and that wherever you see the weak being preyed on by the strong, you will defend them. It's setting out at least a possible ethic, perhaps an impossible possibility, that might actually be at the service of right and not just presume itself to be right because it's mighty. Now, the tales test that to the limit, and there are lots of stories of knights who fall into all kinds of temptation and forget their chivalric oath. But the point is that they've been given an ideal, and they've been given an ideal which in a sense they know they will fail, and that's where the Grail comes in. What do you do when you've failed? But you try. And the whole idea of Camelot is to set before you this ideal that given that we're in a society which has lots of invasions and wars and things, we're going to have a fighting force. But can we have a fighting force that is also courteous and gentle? And that became the ideal of the knight. And, it's there in the Knight's Tale in Chaucer. There was a very perfect, gentle knight, that the knight needs to be courageous and fierce in one respect, but very gentle and tender in another. Now, we can look back and be ironic about that and, and satirize it, because for us, it's an old idea. But this was a radically new venture, and it's never been forgotten. And it's an ideal, it's like Chesterton saying it's not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting. It's that Christianity has hardly been tried at all because it's been found difficult, But here is an attempt. So, I think a lot of the stories are precisely testing that. And of course, in the end, it fails. And it's really important that all the early medieval stories, when Arthur's given Excalibur and asked if he's willing to take this on, he's told explicitly by Nimue, the Lady of the Lake, that if he takes it on, he will fail. He'll have to see everything he's made unmade. One side of Excalibur has the words, "Take me up," and the other side of Excalibur has "Cast me away." And in the end, the sword won't achieve everything, and he has to cast the sword back into the waters and himself be tended in his wounds when he's taken off in the barge for healing to Avalon. But I find we're in an age of extraordinarily greedy and rapacious cynicism. We're seeing a brutalizing of language. We're seeing a brutalizing of behavior. We're seeing a crisis of masculinity as well as a crisis of meaning. And I think there's never been a time that we've needed these stories more.
Talking to Malcolm Guite. Malcolm, it's been lovely to talk to you today, and wish only that we could have talked longer, and so grateful for your good work in the world. And thanks so much for your generosity with being with us today.
My pleasure.
This is Tanya Mosley, co-host of Fresh Air. You'll see your favorite actors, directors, and comedians on late-night TV shows or YouTube. But what you get with Fresh Air is a deep dive. Spend some quality time with people like Billie Eilish, Questlove, Ariana Grande, Stephen Colbert, and so many more. We ask questions you won't hear asked anywhere else. Listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.
Hi there, it's Demetria Kalodimos at the Nashville Banner. Every week I sit down with well-known and sometimes unknown Nashvillians on our podcast, Banner & Company. It's a half hour, give or take, that will open your eyes, touch your heart, make you laugh, and we hope get to know your neighbors in a new and more meaningful way. You're in good company with Banner & Company. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. At No Small Endeavor, we spend a lot of time talking about a good life. But the truth is, a good life is not something we can figure out alone. It's something we discover together in community. That's why we created Endeavor Together. Endeavor Together helps small groups gather to talk about the big questions of life using episodes of the No Small Endeavor podcast. Each series is a simple 4-week guide with questions, short videos, and prompts designed to spark meaningful conversation. We've just released our newest series called A Good Life. It's a 4-part exploration of what it means to pursue a life worth living in community. Here's how it works. Participants listen to a podcast episode ahead of time, then gather with a group to talk it through. We provide the framework for great conversation. The best part is, thanks to our friends at the Lilly Endowment Incorporated, it's completely free. You can explore a good life along with our other conversation series like Let's Disagree Better and Vulnerability by visiting nosmallendeavor.com or clicking the link in the show notes. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.